Hi guys, and we are live with Tavo and Abri today. Hi Tavo.
Hey Juan, really great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on. You've been making some really great content lately, so I'm super stoked to be here.
Thank you. So we want to talk about James Fodor um, naturalistic model for the resurrection.
Yeah, that's the topic. Yeah.
So let me just, I'm just checking my channel to see if we are actually live. Like, oh yeah, it looks like, oh, but the thumbnail is weird. It shows the thumbnail of, okay, while I look at how to change the timeline, why don't you start by explaining your critique of James Fodor resurrection model?
Sure. Let me just make sure I can click through these. All right. Let me provide a bit of a quick overview first. The first thing I want to advise everyone to do is I made a video called The Definitive Critique of the RHBS Model, and I really would strongly recommend that you go back to that because what we're going to have is a little bit of a brief discussion, and we're not going to get through all of these slides. So the video that I made is sort of in a clear way with citations and with evidence-based presentation, looking at all the problems, all my critiques with the model. So I would recommend if you haven't already, go on my channel and check out that video in its entirety. I think that's a really important first step. Now, I really want to acknowledge Dr. Fodor debated me on this. He did a fantastic job. He's such an intelligent individual, and he's got a website with some really incredible resources. So it's not just RHBS, it's really a huge, fantastic body of work. Now, I'm going to provide sort of a very high altitude overview of what my criticisms are of RHBS. But so let me provide an overview first, and then we'll delve into these slides more deeply. All right, so I'm going to talk about major and minor problems with RHBS. So the first major problem with RHBS is it is a model that shows that biases exist, and those biases can result in false beliefs. But here's the big problem. It never shows that Christianity instantiates the features of those biases. So the analogy of investing works really well here. If I say you should never invest money because so many people get swindled and so many people get cheated, I could even word that argument in a way that's really persuasive. And I can make the case, don't invest your money. There's so many cases of people getting their money stolen. But that's not a logical argument, even though it's rhetorically compelling. A logical argument is this is why people lose money when they invest. These are the problems when you invest in certain enterprises. These are the problems with those enterprises. And then I can really kind of hone in on why an enterprise that you're considering investing in instantiates the problems with some manipulative or Ponzi schemes or other things. So James Fodor, again, to restate this argument in a different way, he argues that biases occur and that those biases can result in false beliefs, but he doesn't show that Christianity specifically instantiates the features of those biases. All right, problem number two. There's really no threshold for transitioning from when you should be skeptical, when you should doubt an argument, versus when you should throw it out entirely. Now, the RHBS model works by saying there are these biases, they can result in false beliefs. But the problem with this is there's always biases in all the arguments that we always encounter. So the question is really, when do those biases escalate to such a high degree that we can throw out the argument itself? So Christianity is essentially a set of theological arguments. So the question that we have to ask is, do we throw those arguments out because the biases are so high? And the answer to that isn't provided by RHBS. Now, the third major kind of overarching problem is that the phenomenology of Christianity is never explained by RHBS. And Dr. Fodor has been pretty open in admitting that this is a huge gap. He admits that he can't account for Paul. There's no RHBS features that accompany Paul's experiences. He also admits that the same is true of James. He can't account for why James had his conversion episode. No RHBS features apply to James. He can't account for the early creed formation. So there are several aspects in the phenomenology of Christianity, not just the theology, that aren't explained by RHBS. The fourth problem is kind of this compound probability problem. So there's about 15 different independent agents in the RHBS model and about 43 auxiliary hypotheses. And so you have a lot of low probabilities multiplied together. And when you have like let's say there's even a % chance that Jesus' body got reburied, well, you still have to have like a lot of other features that have to line up really precisely to make RHBS work out as a mechanism. And those features just aren't absent. All right, that's the compound probability argument. And then maybe the fifth is that there's this constrained stopping point problem. So here's the problem. The RHBS features are all cognitive and psychological features. Now, the problem is that those features don't have a precise stopping point. In other words, let's say the resurrection appearances of Jesus were like an erroneous thing that happened for 40 days, but they were all due to sort of cognitive features. Well, the problem is, why did those cognitive features go away after this very precise stopping point? Even if you admit that the appearances of Jesus don't precisely stop at 40 days, and you can kind of quibble about the calendar and the dates, you have to sort of acknowledge that there are Christian movements that develop very early on where there is no resurrection appearance of Jesus. So now let's talk about, those are all sort of the major kind of overview problems. And then there's a bunch of minor problems. I'm not going to enumerate all these, but these will be in the slides. There's the Nicodemus spice problem. Why would Nicodemus spend so much money on spices if the body of Jesus was just going to get moved? There's the new tomb problem. All the synoptic gospels say that the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea was a new tomb. This causes a tumat met, impurification of the actual space itself. So a new tomb would have been worth a lot more. So putting a body temporarily into a new tomb and contaminating that space would have been a very foolish, imprudent decision. Then there's a lot of other individual problems. For instance, the individual lines of evidence that James Fodor cites are problematic in a number of regards, and we'll get into those. Then there's the problem of scale. In other words, RHBS focuses on individual level cognitive features, while we know historical events generally unfold on a sociological scale. And then there's the empirical problem as well, that we know that there are different events that should have the same RHBS features that we can look at historically, many of which are right around the time of the emergence of Christianity as a movement, and we don't throw out other events just because they have RHBS features. All right, so that's a very high altitude overview of what some of my criticisms are. Now let's move on to the next slide. I do have I'm arguing mostly in the negative perspective, but again, Dr. Fodor really does a lot of wonderful work. All right. So now here's my challenge. If you favor RHBS, do you actually believe that it's likely or a probable explanation? Or do you just believe that it's very or even exceedingly unlikely, but it's at least more likely than the resurrection? The reason why that's important is because that's not generally how we choose good theories. Now, the resurrection is the model that gives us at least the smallest number of independent agents, so independent actors. RHBS and minimal witnesses also have this kind of common problem where they're sort of referred to as one model or one, but it's really a set of different explanations. And the problem is when you have that set of explanations, each one of those explanations needs to be validated, and that creates many more moving parts. So the way I think of this is in terms of how many agents need to act in the ways that we would predict to make the mechanism play out. I'm going to skip over some of these slides just to get to the main arguments. All right, so here's the first argument. RHBS does empirically fail as a historical model. And Juan, please let me know if I've gone over time on this. We're at 8 minutes now, so I'm happy to just leave that as an overview, or if you want to, if I just don't know how much time I have for these slides individually. You know, Juan, you may be muted.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I just realized that.
Okay, yeah.
No, I mean, that's fine. Do you want to talk more? Or yeah.
Yeah, I can. Why don't you let me know when I've run out of time, or let me know when I have about a minute left or something. Yeah.
No,
all right.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay.
So what I did is I tested RHBS as a historical model. Now, there's a lot of other historical models that work in multiple different settings, and Dr. Fodor admitted fully clearly that RHBS does not work in other settings. It only disproves the resurrection. It doesn't work in any other settings. Now, here's the problem with that. If I said, "Hey, Juan, I've got a historical model. It works really great, and it proves the resurrection," his first question to me would probably be, wait a second, what other settings have you tested this theory in? And I would say none. It only works for the resurrection, but it does prove the resurrection, and it doesn't work in any other situations. Juan would be right to be at least very skeptical of that. Now, that actually instantiates a mechanism of bias. So if you believe that any instantiation of bias results in rejection of the model, then by this mechanism alone, you should reject RHBS. Now, I looked at 32 events. About 16 of them, these are all events that we know did occur. About 16 of them have RHBS features, and yet historical scholars acknowledge them. I'm not going to go over the individual events. And I just changed the format of the slide to a PowerPoint so it would load in this format, but that's my apology for that. All right. Now, we also know that RHBS is based on biases itself, right? There are several biases. One of the biases that exists in RHBS is, these are biases that exist in the scholarly sector and in the public forum. And one of the biases is sort of this idea that there's the file drawer problem with, if you have an interesting result, you tend to publish it. If you have a mundane result, like, remembering where you put your keys or remembering people that you met, those are mundane conclusions. And those results get filed away, whereas only interesting results get reported. Franco and others in 2014 argued that this is a similar problem where we only tend to publish literature that tends to reject the null hypothesis. So if you don't reject the null hypothesis, then this results in a lower chance of publication, a lower chance that you'll pull out the paper, and also a lower chance that it'll get published. Wickstead et al. Applied this specifically to the conversation about eyewitness memory, saying that because of this, there's been a public diminution in the credibility of eyewitness testimony, and that's been problematic. And that's all because of these biases that occur. There's also a well-documented bias towards bias. So literature generally tends to overstate cognitive biases, and literature also causes, this problem of creating experiments that are designed to increase your estimation that biases exist, that cognitive biases exist, and that human judgment should be questioned. A lot of people have written about this, and there have been a lot of papers on this. Now, this means that RHBS is instantiating the features of these biases that exist. So again, if you agree bias instantiation results in rejection of the theory, then you have to reject RHBS and not the resurrection. Now, I'm going to go through some of these other slides a little more quickly. Now, there's also an unproven assumption of epistemic privilege. In other words, we are saying that we can reliably construct which events were hallucinations, which were confabulations, which were genuine experiences for the disciples. But on the other hand, the disciples themselves, who are closer in time, space, and testimony, are fundamentally unreliable interpreters of their own experiences. So the witnesses can't tell what they experienced, but the modern analyst can. Now, this is an asymmetry, and it's never justified. And here's the problem: that these are the biases that the modern scholar has. We talked about overstatement of novel theories, overstatement of cognitive biases, excessive mistrust of eyewitness testimony. These are all documented. Presentism and personal metaphysical commitments. So these are all biases that the modern scholar has. So again, the question is when you throw out a theory because there are biases, not whether or not there are biases ever. There's also this problem of selective scriptural reference. So Dr. Fodor uses a lot of scriptural resources to make his argument, but the problem is that he doesn't give us a way of determining when we should trust a scriptural resource and when we shouldn't. In other words, he uses the people's initial mistrust of Jesus to say this shows that Jesus didn't actually appear. But then later on, when people sort of acknowledge that that was Jesus that appeared, he throws out their testimony as a later cognitive mechanism. So the problem is there's a trustworthiness filter that's being applied here that is never in and of itself justified. All right, argument number 5. Let's see here. All right, yeah, this is the unobservable cascade problem. So RHBS does depend on a cascade of events. It's complicated, it's not very constrained, and it's much less evidentially anchored. And these are very opaque motivations and actions that Dr. Fodor uses to replace the resurrection. And all of these events not only have to happen, but they also have to happen in the precise sequence that Dr. Fodor prescribes. So each step you can maybe reconcile in isolation, but everything needs to happen in exactly the correct order. So I count about 15 different agents in the RHBS model, which I delineate here. And if you multiply all these probabilities together, you get to a very low probability, and these are very, very generous estimates. You get to a very low probability of roughly around 1 in 8,000. And these are, again, probably very generous estimates of the likelihood. And again, this calculation process is probably more generous still, since every event needs to happen in exactly the right sequence. Now, even Dr. Fodor on the Modern Atheism channel, I think there's a quote from the Modern Atheism channel. He says, the resurrection is super implausible on the order of like 1 trillion to 1, but there is sort of a tacit acknowledgement that RHBS as a thesis is unlikely. It's 1 million to 1. So, and he says, well, that's still way better, even if it is 1 million to 1. Those are precisely his words. So, but the problem is, as the probability of RHBS decreases, it no longer becomes a case for atheism. And I've talked about the Red Sea analogy elsewhere, so I'm going to skip over that for this conversation, and I'm just going to kind of keep going through. I'll probably skip this argument as well. And okay, there is a problem of lack of historical precedent. RHBS is never used as in the positive. It's never applied in test cases, so it's never verified as a historical model. Dr. Fodor does actually use historical examples illustratively, but only by analogy. He never applies RHBS features. So there's no positive discriminatory value for RHBS. There's a little bit of extensive argumentation by analogy in the RHBS model. Let's go to problem number 9. This is the unfocused explanandum problem. So what that means is Dr. Fodor's arguments illustrate the emergence of false beliefs, but it doesn't show that Christianity has the features that also themselves result in the emergence of false beliefs. So the explanandum of emergence of false beliefs is switched out for an explanation for the birth of Christianity. And to explain this on another way, there's sort of 2 levels that are being sort of interchanged. Sorry about that. There are 2 levels that are being interchanged in the RHBS model. The first level is, here are mechanisms by which false religious beliefs can emerge and persist. And the second is, therefore, the resurrection belief emerged through these mechanisms. And this second step is never shown. So there is a logical gap in conflating levels 1 and 2. And then there's a phenomenological gap problem. There's several features about Christianity that aren't well explained by RHBS. We've talked about some of those: Paul, James, early creed formation, the fact that Christianity is initially proclaimed in Jerusalem, We would have expected to find legends about Jesus, if they were legendary indeed, to happen in other regions. There's a problem of behavioral transformation of the disciples. That's never really explained. This is, and there's a lot of other problems. The Sabbath day change problem is another issue. So there's a lot of things in the phenomenology of Christianity that are never explained. Now, there's about 43 different auxiliary hypotheses. So like I said, you can't really think of RHBS as an explanation. You have to think of it as a set of explanations and a set of hypotheses. And every time you raise a specific data point, the model has to permutate to a different auxiliary hypothesis. Now, this all suggests that this is a model that doesn't naturally explain the data, but is instead results in the argument being propped up rather than being sort of a natural explanation that emerges from the data. So I counted 43 auxiliary hypotheses on this slide. Now, another example is the analogy. I'll probably stop in just another minute, Juan, if I'm running out of time. But another problem is the auxiliary hypothesis. Well, why don't I stop there? Because I've gone through a lot of problems, and I've mentioned some of them briefly, and I've mentioned some of them in greater depth. But I'm happy to sort of stop there and just give the floor to you. And I'm sure this is going to be, again, more of a conversation. So I would encourage people to look at my definitive argument against RHBS, and I'll encourage Juan to post that video when he shares this video anywhere, because I think that's kind of a more cohesive, cogent, less conversational, and more well-cited, well-evidenced set of arguments. And I explain things in greater detail than what I've done very briefly right here. All right, so I'll turn the floor back over to Juan. And again, Juan, thanks so much for having me on. And I'd be really remiss if I didn't say James also has a really great channel, makes really great content, and you should check out his website. He's got fantastic stuff. He sings along with a periodic table of the elements. It's really great. He does a lot of things that are really intellectually very interesting. He's got this original research project on the solar system. It's all a lot of really wonderful stuff. So Dr. Fodor's site is really wonderful, and I was very privileged to be in the conversation with him.
Okay, you were done with the slides, right?
I mean, I have more slides, but I think that's a good stopping point.
Yeah, we can add them later if you want. So, okay, so here's what I had to say here. So the first thing, okay, that I wanted to talk about is you say that we can use the same model for other events, right? For 32 events or 16 events, and the James model will make us reject these events, right? And you had one example.
Just to clarify,
yeah,
what I did is I looked at 32 different events. I applied the RHBS model to all 32 events, and then 16 of those events get rejected.
Okay, okay, Lee, look, you brought up the example of Herod during the debate of James, right?
Sure, yeah.
Herod, the death of Herod Agrippa. Okay, I don't get it. Can you explain to me again what you did? Look, what is the first letter in James model mean? James model means reburial, right? How does reburial apply to Herod? Herod, I don't see how it will apply. Like James model is specifically tailored to the resurrection, to what happened at the resurrection. How could you apply it in another context? I mean, how do you apply the reburial part, for example? I don't really see what you're getting at.
Okay, that's an excellent critique. And I do go into that in my video. And so again, people should look at the video because I do present the arguments in a way that's a little more logical. But the R stands for reburial. But basically what James is saying when he proposes the R is he's saying we have an observation, which is the empty tomb, which he himself grants in that model. And he says, let's say that what explanation can we find for the empty tomb? And so he finds an explanation. Most of his argumentation focuses on reburial. So the question is there an event that seems, like it could be theological, but we can find a better naturalistic explanation? Mm-hmm. So in the case of Herod Agrippa, that event is the sudden, widely witnessed death of Herod Agrippa without a clear explanation. Now, sudden death happens all the time, and in modern times we know this. It was the fact that he died suddenly in a very public place, and theological causality was used to explain the death. But we can have a more mundane explanation, right? So that the fact that there's a theological causation that's applied, or at least postulated, but we can maybe conceive of something that's more mundane that could have resulted in that same observation. That's essentially the R. So that's what I'm substituting out for the R. Right. So is there a thing that happened that we can explain through a theological causation and through a mundane causation? So that's how I applied the R. The H, B, and S are all pretty much very similar. So could a hallucination account for it? Could there be biases? Could sociological features be at play?
Okay. Well, I think it is useful in this point to differentiate between the event and the explanation, right? The event is that Herod died, right? The explanation was what some people say, what some legends say, is that Herod was struck down by an angel. That I think that's what Acts says, or it was cursed by God, right? And I think that, historians, James made this point. historians do agree that he died suddenly, actually, but obviously they do not agree. They do not say, yeah, he was struck down by an angel. So it seems like what James says will be right, will be vindicated. And you know what historians say, because what Josephus writes is that he very suddenly he started getting some massive stomach pains, and in 3 days he was screaming with insane pain in the stomach, and then he died. And what historians, many people suggest, is that he was probably poisoned. That somebody put poison on his wine or whatever, right? And that's what happened. So that's what historians say. The historians don't agree that an angel struck him down. So it seems like, yeah, indeed, like you say, yeah, the mundane explanation is the one that we accept. So what is your point exactly? I asked the same that James is asking the debate. I don't see your point there.
Let's go back to that slide that you have up, because I think it illustrates something important, right? So what is the core of the event? Herod's sudden and public death. Okay, so that's the core claim. Now, we admit that happened, right? But we take some of the theological details and the theological causation and the embellishment, and we read that in a more skeptical framework, right? So you're saying that he died, and who knows what caused that? So what is the core of the event? Herod's public death. Okay, that's the core of the event. So what is the core of the resurrection claim? I would argue that the best core of the resurrection claim is the Corinthians Creed, right? Now, my contention is you should take the RHBS features around the resurrection, and you should read some of the theological framing of the resurrection more skeptically. If you really believe in the framework of RHBS, you can do that, and that's fully fine. But there's still a core there that is very hard to refute with without some other reason, right? So what I'm saying is we have a core of each of these events, right? And we can take some of the theological framing and read that skeptically, and that's what historians often do in all cases. But with the resurrection, the problem is the core is the resurrection. Now, what historians do in all 32 of these events is they apply an even methodology across all the events. They accept the core and they read around the theological framing, right? But they think this thing really did happen. Now, the core of the resurrection claim is Jesus reappearing after his death. Everyone admits Jesus died. Everyone admits Jesus had a public death. The core claim there is that that Jesus reappeared after his death. That's the Corinthians Creed, right? It crystallizes within 1 to 3 years. So if your argument is, let's take the theological framing, put it aside, but look at the core of the event. What are the core elements of each of these events? They all have core elements at their core, right? And you can say, well, did an angel appear? Did an owl appear? Were there ominous omens? You can read those things more skeptically. The problem is the core of the resurrection is the appearance of Jesus. That's the core claim.
Okay. Is the core really the appearance of the literal appearance of Jesus, or is the fact that the disciples reported appearances of Jesus? Because even Gary Habermas, he says in his minimal facts argument, he says the way he words it is the disciples reported appearances, right? He doesn't say Jesus appeared. That's the fact that scholars agree with. He doesn't say that. He says the disciples reported appearances, right? There is a minor difference, but it makes a huge difference, right? What is the core event? The disciples reporting appearances, or Jesus appeared, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Okay, and I'm maybe choosing my words a little bit less carefully than I would if I had a script in front of me. But the point is that what I usually say in my videos is apparent resurrection. So that's not really the same as saying the disciples reported an appearance of Jesus, but I think apparent resurrection is a terse enough way to talk about it. So let's say the core of the claim is apparent resurrection. I'm fine with that. I'm not saying the core of the claim is the resurrection, but do we reject the apparent resurrection because of RHBS features? Now, if we reject the core of that, then we have to reject the core of the other 16 events that happen. So, and I'm okay with it. What I'm saying here is we have a core claim. We're all agreeing what the core claim is. I agree that maybe my wording of it was inelegant, but the disciples, felt like they saw Jesus, right? So I call that appearance like sort of an apparent resurrection. And I think that's a fairly neutral way to read it. Now, you and I have discussed this before, and personally, theologically, please keep in mind, everyone I think who watches this channel knows I'm a university professor, but I don't have any theological credentials. So if I'm making any theological claims, keep in mind there's going to be probably some sloppiness there, some inelegance, but and don't take any of my claims as theological. But I personally don't see a compelling scholarly reason to say that the resurrection of Jesus was a bodily resurrection. I think it very much could have been a visionary appearance, right? All of Jesus' appearance to his disciples could have been visionary by my own theological framework. But from a scholarly perspective, I think there's a core of an event that occurred, an apparent resurrection. And to me, I think if you use RHBS to say that core would never happen, if there was no apparent resurrection, then you have to reject the core of 16 other events from that precise time period, from that precise setting that we know actually happened. So my point is this: if you apply RHBS evenly across the events, we have to throw out events that we actually know happened.
Okay, but is James really rejecting the core claim that there was an apparent resurrection? But I think when James says the disciples had hallucinations of the risen Jesus, then that's like he's agreeing with that core. He's saying, yeah, okay, they agree with that there was, for some people, it seemed as if Jesus had resurrected, right? So he's agreeing with the core, don't you think?
No, because he's got H there as a specific explicit mechanism. So if you're saying that that this is about RHBS, right? So the H does stand for hallucinations, and James does endorse post-bereavement hallucinations. But if you're switching out the argument and you're saying, well, we accept that there was an apparent resurrection, and we say we explain it by hallucinations, that's something else. But then we switch the argument to bereavement hallucinations, and I'm fine with that. But that's sort of a tacit walking back or a tacit rejection of the rest of the features in the RHBS framework.
Okay, I mean, just out of curiosity, you only brought up that one example, but with James, what would be like your second strongest example? What would you say is another good example?
Oh, I'm okay pulling that up, but let me look through my notes here.
Yeah, if you have it on top of your head, if it's too much to look up, then it's okay.
I'll look it up while we talk about other things if you want.
Because I have them here. Look, I have them here. These are the ones that you proposed.
Yeah, I just don't have my notes.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. No, it's okay. We can
come back to that though.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's right. So there was this other thing.
But here's the problem, and here's why if we don't come back to that, it isn't a problem. I'm happy to come back to it. But James admits that RHBS is a model, right? And he admits that it's a model that makes a prediction for the resurrection, right? And he admits it's a model that doesn't work in every other setting. In our debate, he explicitly said, it doesn't work in any other setting. I grant you that. I don't need to show that it works in any other setting, right? So the problem is he's sort of already given me that ground. Now, I think it's reasonable to sort of walk that back and say, well, let's think about that in other ways, but you're departing from James's argumentation as he presented it. The way he presented it, he said explicitly in my conversation with him, okay. It doesn't matter. RHBS doesn't need to prove anything else. RHBS can't prove anything else. And moreover, the burden is on, if he wanted to historically validate RHBS, the burden is on the person making the argument. And James has also explicitly sort of endorsed that. He says, if somebody endorses a framework, if they put out a framework, it's their burden to sort of justify the framework. So, and he actually never does that. And moreover, he says explicitly, it doesn't work in any other setting. I think at the very least, the point of this is, if I had an argument for the resurrection and I said it's based on a historical methodology that I've created, and my historical methodology works for the resurrection only, which is something that I already believed in, and it doesn't work in any other setting, I think you'd be like, wait a second, Tavo, I'm pretty skeptical that this is a good argument. If you've got a model and it only works in one setting, and that setting happens to be the one thing that you already previously believed in. Now, I think really the best test of RHBS is if you're neutral on the resurrection, should it move the needle further towards disbelief? Now, I think that's the best litmus test. Now, when I proposed the idea of debating with James, he was very open to it. But before the debate, the day before the debate, he said, we can't just talk about RHBS. We have to talk about RHBS versus the resurrection, right? So I really had to pivot like the day before the event. I think the best way to talk about RHBS is to look at how well it works as a model. And the best way to do that is say, if you're neutral about the resurrection, would RHBS make you more or less likely to accept the resurrection? Would it justify an actual change in that needle away from the 50% position? So, and that's I think is a better question. I was hoping that's what we could engage about today. Is RHBS a better model? I do have some of my notes.
So there was also this other point about divine hiddenness, because James has this argument. He says like, okay, why didn't Jesus appear to people in China? Why didn't he appear to people in America? And you had an answer to that. You say it was explained by basically by your response to divine hiddenness. So what I get from what you say is basically that, okay, so if Jesus makes it too obvious,
Could you put that slide back up just so
okay,
I read the words?
okay, if Jesus makes it like super obvious that he's the resurrection is true, for example, if he appears to the Romans and he appears to the people in China, and then we look at the historical record and we realize, okay, he appeared to people in China, okay, it is true that he resurrected, then it's obvious that Christianity is true, right? Your point, I think what I get from your point is that if we look at that, we say, okay, it's like 100% certain that, Christianity is true. Then in that case, it's like God is compelling people like to believe in him, right? Like forcing belief or something, right? In a way, that's like the traditional answer to divine hiddenness, that God doesn't want you like to force you to believe, like, so that's why he doesn't reveal himself in such a direct way, right? That's what I understand from your points, right? Am I right?
That was one of the points. I think the other point was, let's say Jesus appeared in China or to the Roman Senate, or in let's say he appeared in ancient, Americas or whatever. Would there be any context for his appearance? And I would
Yeah,
argue that the answer is no. There would not be that context, and so
yeah,
we'd be sort of missing that.
yeah, I know. Yeah,
I
I mean, yeah, you're right. They will
yeah.
not know about Judaism, about he will say, he will have to explain all of that, right? He will have to say, okay, I am the Messiah. There is this
Yeah.
religion called Judaism, which God revealed is very far.
But
it's,
there's and then the second thing that I said, which was maybe more in the lines of divine hiddenness, is I think you would still disbelieve in Jesus, right? Let's say we found an ancient book in China about somebody who said that they were Jesus and who appeared. We would debate if the characters are the same. It might not be the same individual. The writing would be different. We would have no way of like knowing that the phonetics of the name was the same. We would look at that at least skeptically, right? So here's the problem.
Obviously, if it's kind of the same, we will debate. But if it's very the same, then at some point there is no debate, right? At some point, it's obvious that it's Jesus.
Well, is it really? I think because I think you could extend. My point is this: I could extend iteratively Dr. Fodor's argument and say, well, why didn't Jesus appear in China? Why doesn't he appear to everyone, right? Why doesn't he appear at my doorstep? Why doesn't he just show up when you're born? Why doesn't he just carve his name in the moon and say Jesus is God? Why is that not written on the moon? And I think there's at least a component that we have to accept, that we are in a universe where there is some degree of divine hiddenness. And if that divine hiddenness exists in our universe to some degree, then we have to sort of reconcile ourselves with that. Now, my contention is this: if there is any divine hiddenness in the universe, then we ought to be able to think about mechanism. So let's say we live in a universe where a God exists as a thought experiment. Let's say God does exist. And let's say also as a thought experiment that this God and this universe have roughly the same features as our universe, right? So we would posit that if God intervened in that universe, if he parted the seas, if he freed some slaves, if he appeared incarnate as a person, if he lived that life as the person and resurrected, that we would be able to find at least some alternative explanation to act as sort of, you could kind of think of this as an intellectual escape hatch, right? So we would probably postulate that. Well, that's exactly what we see. We see an intellectual escape hatch, and that escape hatch is RHBS. So we would conclude, if there is a universe with a God where there is some component of divine hiddenness, that we would always be able to find an alternative explanation, however unlikely. So the fact that we can find an alternative explanation, which is RHBS, I think doesn't prove that that God does not exist.
Okay, here's my question: why did God give us an intellectual escape path? Why did he do that?
Now, what you're getting into is where I think, admittedly, James won the debate, because he is very used to arguing about divine hiddenness, and I am not as good at arguing it. Most of my content, if you look at my channel, is sort of about Jesus and not about the theism versus atheism debate. But I'm happy to get into that a little bit. In other words, you're saying, why doesn't God just show himself to us? Why doesn't God just show up on our doorstep every day? Well, I mean, I kind of think of like, I'm a university professor, but I substitute taught for a while when I was younger, paying bills and such. And one of the things that would happen is I would have fifth graders asking me why they made long division so hard, right? And I would be like, what do you mean? Who made it that hard? Whoever invented math? And I'm like, yeah, it's not that hard. You just got to progress stepwise through your understanding. So in other words, like I know the universe, but I certainly don't know everything about the universe, right? So should I expect that the deity who created the universe would be something who would give me an absolute data blueprint about everything? Like maybe understanding the universe is our journey towards understanding God. Now that's one possible explanation, right? One possible explanation is to say the universe is a tapestry around us that we're gradually unfolding, we're gradually understanding better, and our gradual ascent into theological and philosophical understanding and higher planes of understanding, higher plateaus, is part of the same process unfolding as learning about the universe, right? I think that's one argument. Now, there's other arguments to be made, right? There's certainly an argument to be made that divine hiddenness is maybe something that's being fulfilled for personal spiritual reasons, right? Maybe God appears to me at different times than to you and to other people because there's a specific plan for us. I know people who don't believe in God for most of their lives, who then have very spiritually transformative experiences. It seems that those experiences are at least interesting. And just one, so it may be that there's a spiritual plan for each of us, and that's God's plan, and there's specific reasons for that plan. So maybe the formation of our spirits and our spiritual growth is part of that. And the very last explanation that I want to posit is that is really more of a note that I would expect. You know, let's contrast the God of the Old and New Testament with the God of the LDS. Well, maybe that's mean. Let me put it to you this way: there is a certain poetry in there being some divine hiddenness in the universe, and in the way that Jesus interacts with people, right? Because Jesus doesn't go around telling everyone, "I'm God, start worshiping me," right? He often is very, very cagey about it. He says, you know, you're going to get the sign of Jonah. You're going to get the sign of the fish. You're going to see me do this. Who do you say that I am? Who do you think that I am? Like, so it's often a discourse about figuring out what people say about Jesus. So I think that's at least an interesting and poetic parallel for divine hiddenness. So it seems to me like if the God of the universe did visit humanity, there would be some degree of caginess. There wouldn't be, you know, I'm God, here's my book, here's all the rules, start following them. It would be somewhat like, who do you say that I am? What's your intellectual pathway for perceiving me? Let's talk about that, and let's engage at different levels depending on where you are. Now, the very last thing that I'll say is this argument seems to relate less well to Christianity than to other disciplines. But I thought that if you go back and watch the debate, I would recommend checking out James's arguments. He's a fantastic debater. He definitely out-debated me, and divine hiddenness is a whole other thing that we could spend 3 hours talking about that would get us no further on the discussion about RHBS, but I'd be up for that anytime. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I learn a lot.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, that's good. So I just want to make my point real quick. Here is what many Christians say about divine hiddenness. They say something like, you know, if God appears to yourself like directly, if God writes on the moon, okay, Jesus is real, whatever, that would like force people to believe in him, right? He doesn't want that. That's one answer that I have gotten. But what I say to that is, okay, just how good are you saying that the evidence is? Because if 100%, there's something called the epistemic probabilities. How are the odds of this being true? If having 100% epistemic probability of Jesus resurrecting is the same as forcing people to believe, then you have a problem. If your evidence is too good, if we get like 97% of epistemic probability, well, then that's almost forcing them to believe. Like you can say you have a small escape path, but if it's too small, I mean, at some point, it's pointless. Like that's almost the same as being forced to believe. Like if you look at the evidence and it's like almost certain, right? I mean, that's almost the same as forcing. I see that you still have almost the problem. But if you go too low on this, let's say you have a very big escape path, like it's only like 60% or 50% certain that Jesus rose. Well, at some point you're agreeing with the skeptic when he says, well, it may not be true that Jesus rose, right? So it's like you have to be saying that the evidence is like in this exact spot where you kind of you're not forced to believe, but it's super good. And I just don't see that the two things matching. You know what I mean? You get my point.
I get your point. I think it's very persuasive. And I think your point is implicitly an indictment of many people who go around the world saying the case for the resurrection is ironclad, right? And the problem is when you look into the evidence and it's not ironclad, people get very disillusioned with that. So I think you're making a really important point that where people have to take the evidence into context. Now, the two things that I have to say is, first of all, I think there's, again, an elegant solution in Jesus, right? I know a lot of people, I do some volunteerism, right? And a lot of my career has been volunteering in secular causes. I happen to volunteer at a church right now. But I know a lot of people who would argue that there is no divine hiddenness, zero. They are absolutely certain that Jesus exists because Jesus has appeared to them, right? So that for them, the evidence is right in front of them, right? So I think now, how do you reconcile that? Why does Jesus appear to some people and not others? Well, I think, again, the Jesus solution becomes very eloquent to that, because Jesus isn't saying everyone has to believe me based on this evidence. Jesus is saying each person is going to believe me on different sets of evidence. And so, is there an objective standard? The answer is I don't know. Okay, but let me say this: am I certain that God exists? No, and I've been very clear about that. I'm about maybe 55% certain. Am I certain that if there is a theological figure in history who has had the strongest claim of divine authority, that figure has been Jesus, then my confidence goes up for that proposition specifically. It goes up quite high. So I think if there is a God, there's a relatively stronger case to be made that Jesus had divine authority. Now, that's, again, outside of the realm of the RHBS argument, and that's more towards the CTF argument, which has been my own argument, and I recommend that people check that out. But the main thing there is that there is divine hiddenness in our world. It's different for different people. But I would argue that Jesus' ministry was very, very individually idiosyncratic. There was some people who saw Jesus who was like, "Yep, you're the Son of God," and there were other people who saw Jesus who had several doubts, and Jesus kind of met them where they are. And I think that's kind of analogous to what I see around me every day. Jesus has never appeared to me, and frankly, if Jesus did, I'd probably be like, this is likely to be a hallucination. This is likely to be some sort of drug-induced hallucination. I should probably seek medical attention. But that's because I'm very very skeptical in general.
Yeah.
Good question. These are good questions. These are hard questions, but they're much more broadly philosophical than the granularity through which I approach RHBS.
Yeah. Okay, so I got another question. I don't know what do you think about this topic. Another topic was Messianic prophecies. Another one of James' points of why the resurrection is a priori unlikely is that he says basically that Jesus was not fulfilling all the Jewish Messianic expectations, right? And this is a point where almost everyone agrees, even Christians. They begin by saying, Jews at the time, they expected the Messiah to be a military leader, who will defeat the enemies of Israel and restore Israel and whatever, right? They say, okay, all the Jews expected this. But here's my argument. Okay, why did the Jews expect this, right? It's not because they imagined that. It's because Scripture told them that. Like God in the Old Testament told them that. So if God told them, I'm going to send you a military leader, but then sends them something else, a non-military leader, okay, can we say that God deceived the Jews somehow? Okay, and that's like weird. So James' point is like, we wouldn't expect Jesus not to fulfill the prophecies. And I don't know if you want to respond at this point, but I have other things. I don't know if this is your topic, that you know a lot about this, but there are some Jews make some arguments for why Jesus did not fulfill Messianic prophecies. They say, Jesus didn't build the third temple. Jesus didn't get all the Jews back to the land of Israel. Jesus didn't begin an era of war, peace, blah, blah, blah. Universal knowledge of God, knowledge of Israel wasn't achieved, And he says, they even say Jesus didn't observe the Torah correctly because he says that he violated some commandments and whatever at the Sabbath, stuff like that, So, yeah, that's what one of James' points. You say in the debate, like, okay, this is a contested issue. Scholars contest this Messianic prophecy thing, but I don't know if you have. I know this is not your topic. Like, you didn't really prepare for this topic, so it's not like it's a bit unfair to expect you to have a refutal for Jewish arguments against Jesus being the Messiah, right? Because that's a topic one will have to prepare. But what do you think of this?
Yeah, I mean, so here's what I would start with. I don't get into prophecy fulfillment on my channel. I've looked into it. I don't get into it. And the reason why I don't get into it is because there are such densely evidentiary arguments on both sides. And then, there's so many rebuttals, right? And that it becomes so layered. So there are just as many Christians that believe that Jesus definitely fulfilled prophecy. There are just as many people who are atheists who believe that Jesus did not fulfill prophecy. So the thing that I prefer to focus on is the thing that scholars all agree on. Okay, and one point, and this is maybe the most significant point of agreement among scholars, is that in the last half of the first century, the Jews began to slowly and then quickly redefine a lot of these messianic expectations. right? And that's something that all scholars agree on. So something happened in the first century that caused the Jews to redefine their messianic expectations. Now,
something you mean like Romans destroying the temple? Maybe when you say something happened,
it could have been Jesus, right? It may have been in response to the messianic hopes of Jesus. If you read Yehuda Liebes, he writes about how there was a lot of Christian presence inside Jewish liturgy and Jewish spiritual experience, and things really were changing quite rapidly, but the boundaries between Jews and Christians were very fluid. Now, let's go back to that slide, because I want to at least address a couple of things that you said. All right, let's go back to okay, let's talk about, can you pull up these Bible quotes? Because I've looked into at least some of these, but let's start with Ezekiel 37, 26 through 28.
Oh, okay, let's see if
because I think it's really important to pull up the exact wording.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, because Jews will say this, right? Jews will say, well, Jesus never built the third temple, right? And that's a problem, right? But the problem is that is based on a very physical and very rabbinically verified interpretation of this standard. But that rabbinical interpretation is something that's changed. But let's pull up the wording, because I want to show this. And we can also pull up the wording from Isaiah 43, 5 through 6.
And Christians are going to say, oh, it was a metaphorical temple. Or is that what your point is going to be?
No, well, I think my point is that a lot of these things could be read either way. Now, my other point of this is in the year 90 CE, there was the Council on Jamnia, where a lot of the Old Testament writings were canonically sort of, consolidated. Now, and we don't have to go too far down this rabbit hole, because this is a huge rabbit hole. So if you don't want to pull up these phrases,
I'm looking at. I'm doing it.
Yeah. What's that?
Are you seeing the
I don't see any other screen.
Okay, hold on.
Here's my point to this, is that there's densely evidentiary arguments saying that Jesus fulfilled messianic expectations. There's densely evidentiary arguments saying that he didn't. But what everyone, okay. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever. So where does it say here that Jesus has to build the third temple to prove that he's the Messiah?
Well, I will make a peace with.
Is it I will put my sanctuary among them forever?
Forever. It will be a sanctuary that will last forever, right? So because the second one was destroyed, right? So if there is going to be a sanctuary that lasts forever, well, it has to be a third one, right? I mean, it's not good. It can't be the second one. The second one is gone. So there's going to be one that lasts forever. I mean, it has to be built, right, and lasts forever.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know that means that it has to be built. Why can't the sanctuary that he brings about us is internal, right? The whole thing that Jesus says even before his death, and this is one of the things that scholars mostly agree on, is that the kingdom of God is within us, right? That was kind of one of Jesus' frequent statements that he would say. So why can't that sanctuary be within us? Why does it have to be a physical place?
Well, because sanctuaries are not normally. I mean, you can rationalize anything saying it's a metaphorical thing and it's inside of us, but that's at some point like really ad hoc. I mean, if it says,
but to me, even reading this neutrally, I will put my sanctuary among them forever, it doesn't necessarily mean it will be a physical building.
How on earth is a sanctuary? I mean, the natural reading, at least, of a sanctuary is for God. A sanctuary for God is a physical building. It's a temple where that's what a sanctuary refers to.
Let me steel man this for a second, because rabbinical interpretation is definitely 100% on your side, right? Rabbis, if I talk to a rabbi about this precise phrase, they would say, yes, this means that Jesus should have built the third temple, right? Now, Bart Ehrman actually agrees with what E.P. Sanders said, which is that Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, right? Now, if you believe that, then Jesus is saying before the temple is destroyed, the temple is going to be destroyed, and I will rebuild it within 3 days, right? Meaning that he will become the new temple. Now, I'm not saying that, this is through a very highly Christological lens, which I'm not sure that I definitely ascribe to. But my point is this: you can go back and forth on this. I don't know that a neutral reading compels me to say Jesus was supposed to build a physical temple.
Okay. Yeah, okay. But let me just give you some pushback here. So there is a messianic prophecy. Sometimes people Christians point at Zechariah, where it says, "They look at me, who they have pierced, right?"
I think is Isaiah 53 piercing.
No.
This is the Zechariah piercing. Okay.
They look at me, who they have pierced, right? And blah blah blah. They see, because it has been pierced. And there is another one that says, like a lion, they pierced my hands and my feet, right? And they say
Yeah,
this is a messianic prophecy for Jesus, because look, it applies to Jesus. He has been pierced, right?
yeah, pierced his hands and feet. Yeah.
Okay, what is stopping me from saying, oh, well, it doesn't say it was a literal piercing. Maybe the prophecy say it was a metaphorical piercing, so it doesn't really apply to Jesus, because Jesus had a literal piercing, but that prophecy it went to a metaphorical piercing. I mean, it could go both ways. If I can just go and say metaphorical, literal, this. I mean, if there's a word, I can say, well, it could be a metaphorical X. A word says X, I could say, oh, it could be a metaphorical or a non-literal X. If my prophecy doesn't fit, I can do this with any prophecy.
Yeah, well, and I have two things to say in response to that. The first thing is, you're right; it could go both ways. So I think the argument is a wash. Essentially, that's really what I honestly think. I think you could make the argument either way. I think there's a strong set of arguments. The second thing that I want to say is, if you look at some of these things, I'll admit that a neutral reading suggests that Jesus did not fill a specific expectation. But if you look at other things, I will argue that a neutral reading would suggest that Jesus did fulfill some expectations. So which way do you go with that? He fulfilled some and not others. I think that still leaves us sort of at a neutral stance. And so here's my point. Any way you slice it, as an academic, when I look at these arguments, I think it's basically a wash. So I don't think the argument is as clear as James Fodor presents it, where he says clearly Jesus did not fulfill the expectations. I think he makes the argument really rhetorically persuasively. I don't think when I've looked into the evidence that it's that cut and dry. But I also think when Christians tell me, like, get into prophecy fulfillment, because Jesus clearly fulfilled 3,000 prophecies, and there's a one in one. I can't remember the number that it gets. 1 over 10 to the power of 80 that Jesus could have fulfilled all these prophecies. Have you heard that line?
Yeah. I heard that.
When I like look into that, I'm like, that's not right.
Yeah.
So to me, there are people on both sides who misrepresent the degree of certainty in the argument, and that's why I don't get into it, because I think the arguments become super evidentially dense, right? But my point is, let's just consider that a wash, and we could be debating that forever. But if I said that as neutral, then I think James makes the argument pretty persuasively. I think he's rhetorically excellent at it. If I were in a debate with him, or even with you, if you kept pushing me on this stuff, you'd win the debate ultimately, right? But my point is, I'm not a theologian. I'm just reading these things academically. And when I study them independently on my own, I think there's some prophecies that point towards Jesus. There's some that don't. I will say this. I think if you read the Old Testament in a very neutral way, I think there's several signs that point towards Jesus as a hermeneutical key. In other words, I think Jesus clarifies some of the lessons of the Old Testament. And that maybe is a more persuasive argument than literal prophecy fulfillment. For instance, like I read the story of Jonah, and I'm like, wow, Jonah slept in the boat. The storm came. Jonah was asleep. They woke up Jonah. Jonah quelled the storm. Jesus quelled the storm. Jonah offered himself to the storm. Jesus controlled the storm. Jonah means passive messenger. Jesus means active messenger. But can I prove mathematically that those ways in which Jesus is a hermeneutical key are not simply my own pareidolia? The answer is no, I can't. I've tried to. I've looked into that. I don't think there's a convincing proof on either side. These are challenging questions, Juan, and I think you're right. I wasn't ready to debate that, but I think we're, I think it's a hard argument for me to win or lose. I think it's a hard. If I've seen debates, and I think it's hard for either side to definitively win or lose the argument.
Okay. Let me look at this last point. This one is good. I think this is probably your strongest point, and generally the strongest point of apologists. Like, the idea is that you need all of these events to happen when you say in a precise sequence, right? I have a little quibble with that, but the point is you need all of these events which individually are unlikely, right? And you need them to happen, all of them, right? And the problem is that you need the conjunction of all of them, so the probabilities add up in a way that you showed us the math earlier. Like, this ends up with being like 1 in 10,000 or less, like even being generous, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So you have to, what the probability that the body gets removed, right? Whatever probability that was, 50%. Okay, you already have 50%, but then what is the probability of bereavement hallucinations happen? If we go like each one has 10%, and we need at least 2 or 3, that gets us to like 1%, 0.1%, and we have to combine it with the 50% from early. So we are already like at 1 in 500 or whatever, and the more we start adding things, the worse it gets, right? You also need memory contagion to affect the disciple,
Yeah,
social pressure. So yeah, I think I think so. Mike Licona also make that point. I think it's probably his strongest point. They say is like he's saying like at some point it's just too many things, right? And even if you say because of some probability one of them can obtain, right? But what are the odds that all of this will happen, right? You have the conversion of Paul. You have also the odds. What are the odds that James, a skeptic, would convert, right? What are the odds that all of these hallucinations will take place? What are the odds that the tomb will be robbed, right? So that's the argument here. So I actually, what I try to say here is, I think if we look at any historical event, there are many historical events, we can look at it, and if we break it down, like, okay, let's break down all of the sub-events that happened. We could probably make the same argument with many historical events, and then say, but at the end of the day, it did end up happening. And I had a good example here. I asked ChatGPT to give me a good example here. The spread of the QAnon conspiracy, the historical rise of QAnon around 2017, 2020. If we decompose it the same way, we get like, I added a red point to the ones that I find like those were unlikely, right? So 1, an anonymous internet user posts cryptic predictions on an obscure message board. 2, a small group of followers interpret the post as secret government intelligence. 3, the predictions fail. 4, this was unlikely. Followers reinterpret failures rather than abandoning the belief, and online communities reinforce each other, blah blah blah. 6, for example, this was unlikely. Influencers amplify the story across platforms. 7, that was very unlikely. The movement spreads to millions of people, right? Blah blah blah. So if we do the same thing, we will say, hey, that didn't happen, for example, or it was a miracle. This had a really bad probability, right? So each step has some probability. The probability of all of them happening in sequence is even lower. So we could do the same thing. I think, there's another example. It's even funnier.
But no. I'll let you keep going. Go ahead. You let me talk. So go ahead, no, please.
It's very quick. There's one guy who got hit by a lightning 7 times. This was recorded. Dale Allison makes this example. That's like the most unlikely thing I think that has been recorded in history, and it still happened.
Yeah. So, but here's why I think you can go back to that slide for a second. I think it's useful because it illustrates something really important. What are the probabilities that the QAnon conspiracy would result? Very, very low. Okay. But what are the probabilities that a right-wing alt-right conspiracy within one of the modern echo chambers would result? I think that actually becomes really high. And if you look at other movements that have I don't want to get political, so maybe all right, I guess I'll just get political, but like the anti-vaccination movement, that has a lot of different elements that are very similar. The Pizzagate movement, that has a lot of elements that are very, the incel movement, right? There's a Philbro movement now. That's very, there's this cuck the kick movement, which I don't even know what that means, but the only reason I know what that means is because somebody commented towards me saying you can cut the kick on one of my videos. So I didn't even know what that meant, to be honest. But there are a lot of different things, right? So my point is this: if RHBS works as a mechanism, then you should see lots of other Jesuses. Now, by any definition, Jesus is, even if I knew nothing else, but I just knew about the Christianity, I would say, well, Jesus is at the very least an idiosyncratic figure, right? There just aren't that many movements where decapitation results in rapid spread of a movement. This is a pretty reasonable fact that a lot of people agree with. Now, here's what's even more interesting, is Jesus is not only idiosyncratic in that respect. He's not only idiosyncratic when it comes to the formation of Christianity, he's also idiosyncratic in other ways, right? So if we look at how historically unique Jesus is in terms of his contribution to postmodern academia, we can find a lot of objective metrics that look at ancient figures in academia and how often they pop up. There's almost no other ancient figures that pop up in a bunch of different disciplines as influencing postmodern scholarship. And I'm talking about Carl Jung cites Jesus in a way that's constructive. Ludwig Wittgenstein cites Jesus in a way that's constructive. George Bernard Shaw, Leo Tolstoy, Hannah Arendt, Simone Weil. So Jesus shows up constructively. So people adding to the teachings of Jesus and reinterpreting those teachings to create modern or postmodern lessons that are relevant in a postmodern or modern context. Now, that in and of itself is a way that Jesus has sort of bucked a trend and become a historical figure that's quite unique. Now, I've previously argued about this. If you hyper-focus on the resurrection itself and you look at the evidence, I think you're missing a bigger point. And the reason I can prove that is because if I died tomorrow and then I resurrected 3 days later and I appeared to, let's say I even appeared to 500 people, okay, does that prove that I resurrected? Well, maybe, maybe not. We can quibble about that. But the real point is anyone going to be talking about that event in 5 years, in 10 years? What about in 2,000 years? No one's going to talk about it. No one's going to care. They're just going to be like, yeah, maybe there's a historical footnote about this guy Tavo who appeared after he died, and it's interesting, and that's the end of it. The reason why is I leave behind no significant intellectual legacy. Now, here's where the conversation about Jesus really diverges from this point. And that is that Jesus leaves behind interesting teachings that are a topic of conversation 2,000 years later, right? So at least in this regard, Jesus has shown that he has some ability to at least be unusual or defy what our statistical expectations would be. There's no other ancient figure who shows up with multidisciplinary, postmodern academic relevance to the degree of Jesus by a lot. Maybe the next biggest candidate is probably Socrates. But if you look at where Socrates shows up, it's really just philosophy, history of philosophy, and classics. It's not really that much of an interdisciplinary relevance. Now, the last thing that I want to say to this is that, let me just underscore the point that the QAnon conspiracy can be treated as an idiosyncratic event. But we have lots of other different conspiracy right-wing movements that are very, very different, but have very, very similar features, right? So I would argue that if you had a behavioral model to approach ways that these conspiracy theories evolve, it would actually explain a lot of those. And there are different models that people have that are sociological that explain a lot of different conspiracy theories and conspiracy theory organizations. The problem is that there aren't a lot of different models that explain Jesus and explain Jesus well. And most of those models in and of themselves are quite disparate. They rely on several different explanations. So here's the point. After 2,000 years of discussing this, maybe the best arguments that we have for the resurrection are RHBS and minimal witnesses. But both of those models have a lot of different moving parts. And the problem is this: if you rely on inference to the best explanation, you're still just left with an argument for the resurrection. If you rely on any kind of set of explanations, then you can choose RHBS, you can choose minimal witnesses. But here's the real problem, okay? If you don't believe in the resurrection, RHBS is not going to move the needle for you. You're just going to say, I don't believe in the resurrection, and you might cite RHBS as your reason for not believing, but at the end of the day, it's just going to be something that makes you feel better about not believing. It shouldn't independently, in and of itself, based on its own persuasiveness as a model, move the needle for you.
Yeah. I forgot so let me say, you said we have no other Jesuses, but I mean, don't you think maybe we do have other Jesuses, like, all these Messianic pretenders like Sabata Sevai, or there's this other guy, Bart Ehrman talks about this in his book, but Baal Sev Tov or something like that. I don't know, but he makes the point that the evidence we have for his miracles is very similar for Jesus. I wanted to make a video about him. Is Baal Sev Tov or something like that. It was some Jewish guy in Poland or something. This
is different than Sabbaty Zevi, right?
Yeah. I mean, or even like, for example, I don't know, Joe Schmidt, right? The guy who invented Mormonism. I mean, no, wait, I mean, the appearance of the angels and the golden plates, that's still an alleged supernatural event, right? It's not the same as a resurrection, but it's still like, I mean, there's some similarities. I mean, it's like you want them to be exactly like Jesus. And you say, well, Jesus is mentioned, so much, in our journals and whatever. I mean, because that's the religion that by accident became the number one in the West, right? By an accident of history. And so that's why I would say,
those are two different sets of arguments that you're making.
Yeah, that's right. Let's focus on the first one first. Yeah, that's right. Let's separate.
Okay, let's focus on the analogy to Joseph Smith. I think that's a really persuasive one. Can you name a single teaching of Joseph Smith that's interesting, that's nourishing, that promotes a good idea, a good value system, independent of the New Testament?
You got me there, but
they're the wrong person. I know to ask. Yeah. Well, let me put it this way. Just yesterday, some LDS missionaries showed up at my door, and they wanted to talk about. And I was like, I need to practice debating. I'm not a good debater. I'm not very articulate. I've had a lot of speech problems and language problems for all my life. I got filtered through a bunch of different languages, so I'm always very, very inarticulate in these settings. So I try to, like, if I ever sound like sort of if I ever sound like somebody who's like a video talker person. It's because I'm over enunciating and overly trying to compensate for my own speech problems. But anyways, I was like, okay, I need practice debating. So these Mormon missionaries showed up, and I asked them that question. I was like, if I have teachings from Jesus, what marginal incremental value is a teaching from Joseph Smith? And they were like, well, he clarifies these lessons from the New Testament. And I was like, but I already have those lessons. Can you give me one good thing that he said that Jesus didn't already say? Or one good thing that, not that he said, but one good thing in the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith didn't say? And here's my counter argument is that Joseph Smith is very well represented in the United States, and yet we don't show his teachings ever showing up in the scholarly literature, right? Now, the people who cite Jesus aren't just citing him because they like him. It's not just because they're exposed to him. It's not because they're fond of him. They're citing Jesus because they are building on his teachings constructively. So they're saying, here's an idea that Jesus had. Let me build on that by adding this component to it. So that's one.
Are you sure that's what scholars are doing when they mention Jesus?
Yeah, check out my video on the CTF argument, because Hannah Arendt, for instance, is one of the most influential political scientists of the last century. So she's an important postmodern political scientist. She's not, somebody can fact check me on this. I don't think she's a Christian. I believe she's an atheist. But her argument is this, that, you know, everyone knows her theories, right? She's very familiar to the lay public because she had all these theories about the banality of evil. That's a phrase that she came up with, the banality of the evil. But the point is, she built on those teachings constructively. Now, you can argue, well, okay, well, people had access to the teachings of Jesus and they didn't have access to the teachings of Buddha, so this is really Christian predisposition. But here's the problem. Nobody cites Paul this way. There's no other Jewish or Christian figures that get cited to this degree. Now, here's the other problem is they're not otherwise talking about the New Testament in such terms. And moreover, these are not people who are like talking about Jesus in ways that are flattering. Now, here's the other problem. Let's say that Buddha had equally important, nourishing, and I think Buddha has great ideas, by the way. So this is not like a comparison with other religions, but let's say that Buddha had a lot of great ideas. It is likely that those ideas would have quickly spread and been expropriated to modern Occidental academia in the Western world. And the way I can tell you that is because a lot of meditation practices, which are very Eastern, right, spread to Occidental scholarship, right? We very quickly adopted mindfulness practices, meditative practices. Those show up in the cognitive science literature, in the neuroscience literature, and they show up in a lot of other ways. So the point is that when we have ideas from elsewhere in the world, they actually get expropriated into Occidental scholarship quite rapidly. So the argument that this is just because people are exposed to Jesus and they aren't exposed to these other individuals, I think it's possible. It's maybe a direction of bias, but I think it's a fairly tenuous argument to make, especially when you consider all the other things that I just mentioned. Do you want to take some questions from the audience too? I don't know how much time you have, but I know we're live right now, so we could do that if you want. Yeah,
we can go to questions for the audience and then wrap it up. Okay, I don't see many people actually. That's the problem. I don't know. So guys, if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat. But the problem is this is my first live, and I don't know how to set up a live in advance. How to schedule a live. Like Real Seekers. In his channel, he's going to be live, and you can click notify me. You know it in advance, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how to do that. I tried, but I didn't work. So that's bad because it's like it just appears live, like without people knowing. So.
Well, let me ask you a question then. You don't believe in the resurrection, right? You're an atheist, right? Do you believe that the RHBS model is a good model? Is it a good explanation? Or does it actually, when you heard this, were you like, I am now more certain that the resurrection didn't happen? Because that's the real test for me. Does the needle move on the resurrection acceptance because of RHBS? And if so, why?
No, I think I was already, it's not like, no, I don't think it's like as an agnostic, it's already, I look at the resurrection and I think, well, something weird must have happened. I don't know what, but probably something, must have happened. They got someone lied, they had hallucinations, whatever, But when I look at it, it's not like I look at the model and I tell myself, oh yeah, that's what could have happened, right? Now I believe it even less. Yeah, I don't really say that, but it was already at the point where I don't believe it, right? So it doesn't like do much, I don't think.
Well, I think that's an indictment of the model, right? If you can't point to something in the model that increases your degree of certainty, I think that makes the model not a good model. Now, we didn't get into it, but you mentioned hallucinations there. I'm happy to talk about post-bereavement hallucinations because I think one of the things that Dr. Fodor does, I won't say, one of the things he does that's problematic is the literature that he shows is, and I go into this a little bit in my video, but the literature doesn't quite show the conclusion that he needs it to show. One example is he cites this paper by Gadet, and he says, this shows that people with post-bereavement hallucinations can then change their mind and have a resurrection belief, right? Now, this is a single case report that this one author puts out where he talks about a 26-year-old who is seeing his mother who had deceased as a post-bereavement hallucination. Now, when you read the paper, actually, it says the opposite of what Dr. Fodor is actually claiming, right? It says this 26-year-old admits that people don't return to life after death. And moreover, when he sees his mother, he acknowledges that it's in spectral form. And here's the really interesting part. The mother actually in these visions tells him, don't touch me because I'm not really in this world, right? So here's somebody who has as convincing a set of post-bereavement hallucinations that you could have, and he still doesn't believe that his mother actually resurrected. So at what point do you say, well, we've got thousands of cases of post-bereavement hallucinations. None of those have a resurrection delusion attached to them, right? I think at some point you have to say a resurrection delusion is not something that a post-bereavement hallucination would give you. So, I mean, I think that's pretty persuasive. And the problem is the way James shows the paper, he shows it as though it's an example of someone believing that his mother had returned to life, when the paper actually clearly says people who have died do not return to Earth, and that was a belief that this patient had.
Yeah, I mean, I think those studies were made in the modern world, right? Like they're asking people in the modern world who have hallucinations, right? But do you believe that the person rose from the dead? And I think people in the modern US are obviously going to say no. But if you ask them in a superstitious era, 2,000 years ago, in a different country, then maybe you get different answers. Right? So I think that's like the key difference there.
Well, and I have a couple of responses to that. First response is a lot of the post-bereavement literature that we have is actually in people with impaired reality testing. These are people who are schizophrenic, right? So, and have other types of organic psychoses. So if that's the case, we would expect them to be sort of closer models to what we might see in the ancient world, right? The second thing that I have to say is there's no actual reason to, what you're citing is sort of an argument for presentism, right? We know more now, we understand more now, we're sort of more critical thinkers now. But I think there's several problems with that. It's number one, there's no real reason to believe it, right? Number two, we have a lot of reasons to argue against that, particularly in ancient Judea. One of those reasons is we know that there was sort of this understanding that prophecy in first century Judea was in the Second Temple period was not felt to be as reliable. In other words, they understood that they were living in an era that was some 5 or 6 centuries removed from any legitimate prophet, right? They were not expecting to have theological revelations, right? They were living in a time of interpreting scripture. In fact, they even said, theological revelation and prophecy is no longer the realm of the prophets. It's now been given over to fools and children. That fools and children line is the line that shows up frequently in first century Jewish literature. Second, we know that from the Jewish literature, there was a tradition of massive skepticism about anything that had a single witness attestation. They needed multiple witnesses just to reset the monthly calendar each month, right? Number three, they had actually literature about ghosts, right? So if anything, if Peter had experienced the risen Jesus and just said, oh, you're a ghost, you're a specter, he would have said, this is a ghost. Like they knew what ghosts were. There was literature about ghosts. They had sort of an understanding that ghosts were a thing that could happen. And number four is, again, you have the same stopping point problem. If these were all hallucinations, if they were all experiences based on some weird psychological phenomena, some cognitive bias, then why did it stop at 40 days? Why didn't other people come along and say, yes, I also experienced the resurrected Jesus months later or years later even? We know that the Christian center didn't have that kind of hierarchical control over
You mean
the
like
Gnostic
Paul?
realm. Well, Paul had a visionary experience by his own admission, right? And there was some understanding that what he had was a more veridical visionary experience, but Paul didn't interact with the physical Jesus. So I would argue, if anything, Paul's example actually supports the case that I'm making. In other words, let's say Peter saw the physical Jesus, right? And why didn't the authors of the Gnostic Gospels just say, yeah, I saw the physical Jesus too, and he actually came back to me and he said this thing? No one else seems to say that. No one else seems to be making that case that Jesus, they have visionary experiences, and some people have it still to this day have visionary experiences, but no one says Jesus actually resurrected now. In other words, why was there that sort of abrupt stop in resurrection experiences? I think there's a lot of reasons to think that your contention seems to be the baseline sort of presumption of people who are engaged with presentism, who say, this was a long time ago, people had all kinds of crazy beliefs. And that's intellectually appealing, but I don't know that it's really borne out from our understanding of what the literature actually shows about it.
Right. So you say about that back then there was no theological prophets and theological this
Yeah,
or
there's
that.
a
Wow.
lot. Josephus wrote about this. They wrote about this in Maccabees. Second Lamentations writes about this. All the Jews in first century Judea understood that they were living in a time period where legitimate prophetic insight was no longer something that they were seeing around them. They
What about
they acknowledged the time of the prophets is over.
John the Baptist? Wasn't he like maybe like a bit like a prophet?
A little bit, but I think there was a degree of theological revelation that he didn't have either, right? If you're talking about like the time of Zechariah, right, Habakkuk, like these were all the other people who were the last few books of the Old Testament. That was an era that had ended about 5 or 6 centuries prior to that. In fact, there's this whole thing in Maccabees where they're debating what to do, and like Israel seems kind of lost. And the reason why they say that Israel is really lost is because there's no more prophetic voices to guide them. There's no Elijah, there's no Elisha, there's no Zechariah. Like, so they're kind of lost without the prophets to guide them and tell them what to do. There's no legitimate voice of God. There's no presence of God in any legitimate way. And John the Baptist would say, make straight the path. We probably don't have enough information about what his other teachings might or might have been or how they were received. But we know certainly that the impact of John the Baptist on Jewish theology and literature and liturgy and spirituality was much, much more muted compared to the influences of Jesus. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you say that those people back then, 2,000 years ago, were very skeptic, and you deny that they were superstitious, that sounds like a really hard case to sell to me, because to me just like,
Well, I don't have to sell the case, right? I mean, we can look at their writings. Like we know that they were not experiencing theological prophetic insights, and we know that they were lamenting that. They said theological prophecy is the age of legitimate prophet is over. They are now in the age where like prophecy has been given over to fools and children.
okay, yeah, okay.
I mean, they were still interpreting, they were still rabbinical, they were still arguing, but they weren't like there was this sort of widespread understanding in Jewish intellectual circles of the Israelites in first century Judea that there wasn't like somebody would come along and say, "Oh, God actually says this." No one's going to no one's going to challenge their knowledge base of what God actually said.
Yeah.
Do you want to take any questions from the chat too?
Yeah, there is nobody.
Oh, okay.
And I think we can wrap it up here. Like, it's been like almost 1.5 hours.
Sure.
I hope, we will see how it goes. And do you want to give us like any last words or like some final thoughts on James model or whatever you want to share with the audience, or to say anything to the audience? Yeah.
Again, I think the really critical thing is check out my whole video, because I'm not always as articulate in real time as I am when I have like a script in front of me and I have time to put together my thoughts and I have time to develop the citations. So I would check out that video. I would definitely check out a lot of Dr. Fodor's arguments. He's a really fantastic thinker. Juan, you've put out some really incredible content lately. You've been on a roll too. So definitely people should check out your other content. And then the other thing is, though, I think there are some really big problems with RHBS that we've sort of scratched upon even in this brief debate. And they do take a while to go into. So check out the video. But I think as we've talked about, there's some sort of big overview problems, which are some gaps in the RHBS model. Now, I think the biggest thing is when I debated with Dr. Fodor, he was like, you cannot look at the model in isolation. You can only look at it by contrasting it with the resurrection evidence. I think that alone is sort of a tacit admission that by itself, RHBS is not a good model. It only works well if you already dislike the resurrection and you want to argue against the resurrection. So I think that in and of itself is a potential contextualization that I think is important. But go back to the beginning of the video and just look at all of the overview points that I made about RHBS. And we didn't even get to all of the more granular things about the problems with reburial, like the fact that reburial was not something that was taken lightly. There were specific rules of when a reburial would happen. That we didn't talk about the fact that if the body of Jesus had been moved, that the family would have been notified. And so the likelihood that the disciples wouldn't have had that information goes way, way down from that. And there's a lot of other reasons why these mechanisms in RHBS just don't work out very well. But you've asked some really challenging questions, Juan. I hope people watch this video in its entirety. And I definitely hope that when I promote this, I'll give you a big shout out, because your channel has been really on a roll, and you've got a really fantastic channel. I hope people check out my content. I hope you'll check out the CTF argument as well on my channel. And please like and subscribe to Modern Atheism, but please go back and check out my video, and check out a lot of my arguments. I hope you like my channel, you like the videos, and you subscribe to my channel as well. We're close to 500 subscribers, which doesn't sound like we're a huge channel, but we've only been around for 8 months. So I think that's pretty impressive given the short time frame that we've had so far.
Yeah, great. That's great. Yeah, I hope your channel keeps growing. Yeah, you deserve it.
Thanks, Juan. That's kind of you to say.
So yeah, thank you guys. I'm going to be adding a link to the description to Tavor's main video on James' hypothesis. So yeah, go check that out if you want. And okay, yeah, thank you for watching, and see you next time. Bye.